Okay, we are in letter 15. I don't know how else to describe where we're up to. It's the phrase is al derech mashal, as a way of analogy, as the drop that comes from the brain, which is very subtle, or is very, very subtle. Is that I hope everyone can find it, and there are different prints of Tanya that we're using. And to recap, the concept of this chapter is to explain the idea of the spheres. Now, we've talked about it already. We'll just take a few minutes to sort of catch us all up. There is a quote that when Abraham Avinu is campaigning for Hashem to possibly uh, uh, exonerate the people of Sodom and Amorah, at least to stay their execution, that Abraham says, "Vanoichi offer ve'efar." I am simply dust and ash. And in addition to this being a description of his, of his humility, it is describing to us that even Avram Avinu's loftiest of level of kindness is still only a remnant. It's just a taste, like the ash is the essence of, but just a remnant of the original piece of wood. So too is Avram's chesed, which is this is the loftiest level where he's campaigning for the forgiveness of these people who are not that forgivable, and still this is only considered like dust and ash. So that's the one side of the ledger. Because remember, we have this sort of back and forth where we do compare the concepts we understand to help us understand Hashem, and then we go back and say, well, that can never really understand Hashem. And we have this vacillation, which is very necessary. So with that all sort of being acknowledged, and that's on the table, we then start to talk about the spheres. And remember that our purpose of talking about the spheres is to give us an insight into how we can operate within these spheres. Meaning we're not just here for some other data, sort of like writing some academic text so that we can rephrase the same thing. If you remember the analogy from gravity, everyone recognizes that when you drop your pencil, it falls to the floor. What is that? That's gravity. What's gravity? It means that when you drop your pencil, it falls to the floor. It's just a word to describe a phenomenon that we're already familiar with. But then we push back and say, well, once we understand what gravity is, then we can understand how best to work with gravity. So we intuitively are aware of certain character traits that are more focused on being generous and certain character traits that are more focused on being restrictive, et cetera, et cetera. So what then is the value of discussing the spheres and giving them names and terms and so forth? Because the more in-depth understanding we have, the more they become functional tools to help us grasp and understand and reconstruct our relationship with ourselves and ultimately with Hashem. So we talk generally about really 10 spheres, and for our discussion, we'll say 10 identifiable aspects within ourselves that are a reflection of Hashem, but again, a reflection like dust and ash. We always have to have that qualifier. 3 are of the intellect. That is what Chabad is. 7 are of the character. So again, we have a tendency to think, well, this is who I am, this is what I do, and this is just the way it is. And one of the gifts of Chassidus is that we are not simply the product of our biological imperative. By understanding the spheres, we can start to understand our ability to maneuver those spheres, to identify those characteristics. Because, again, most people, much of the time, overgeneralization to be sure, they simply assume that the way that they behave is the standard normal way. Well, everybody gets angry when someone does that. Well, of course you're going to help that person. And as is the standard, whatever I do is reasonable and whatever other people do is bizarre. Bizarre in the laudatory, you don't expect me to be Abraham, or bizarre in the cruel. I'm not like that guy. So by understanding the spheres, we're not just, again, adding academic terminology to concepts that we already intuitively are aware of. Rather, we are giving ourselves a method through which we can maneuver, manipulate, bend and shape our character, which is, again, the ultimate objective here. We're not just here for academia, we're here for strategies and tactics for having a real, intense, and genuine and vibrant relationship with the infinity of Hashem. So we have our chart, which we've sent out to everybody, but just to look at it again for a minute. So hopefully everyone can see it on their screen. So remember, we're going right, left, and lower center like an inverse triangle. The first row, which is Chachma, Bina, and Das, imagination, analysis, application, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, whatever English words are more meaningful to you. And remember that the spheres are not moral or immoral. It's what we do with them. So they're like tools. A hammer is not a moral or immoral object. It's what we do with it. So the first stage is chesed, limitless giving, which is not always beneficial. Gevura, restraint. Tiferes, the blend. Step 2, which, as you see, it's a derivative of step 1. Netzach, which is endurance, which is a type of limitlessness. Nothing's going to slow me down or stop me. Hod, which is glory, which allows for the others to have glory, which is restraint. Or if I'm a bully, then I push them down so I have glory. Again, it's restraining either my glory to allow someone else to have the glory, or restraining someone else's glory so I have it. And Yesod, which is basic connection, or we might call it like a charisma or something like that, that allows the person to connect with the other person. The intellect is the origin, the character is the product, and the application is in tier 3. And again, it's all manifest via Malchus. So I'm a nice guy, doesn't mean I'm doing something nice right now. In order to do something nice, my chesed has to make its way down to Malchus. And these aren't silos where they operate exclusively independent of each other. There is interconnectivity between them and cooperation between them. And one shades the other, and so forth, as we will explore. Okay. So again, we are hoping to have some tangible terminology to place on concepts which are innately infinite. So here we are. Again, I hope you could find it where it is in the text. Al derech mashal, ketipa hayeredes ma'amayach shu daka dak miyoid ma'oid v'nasas gasa v'churmius mamish v'kleis v'trein bein. So too, we talk about the idea, like the development of a child, which is a common analogy for all of creation, that we take the most abstract idea and we manifest it until it becomes something very specifically material. And through this, it is able to be creative. V'gam netzach v'hoid. That's why netzach and hoid, which again are tier 2, that is, netzach is the derivative of, or the action of chesed, and hoid is the derivative of and the action of gevura. They are nikra, they are called schokim v'rechayim. They are called grinders and millstones. Why? Because just like we take the raw wheat, and raw wheat is essentially innately, in that moment, it's not very valuable. What can I do with it? I have to grind it, and I have to prepare it, and I have to turn nature into art. So on the natural side, there's much greater energy, but that energy is going to go to waste unless it is transformed into art. And the art, the mechanism for transforming it into art is, again, the grinder that takes the raw wheat and turns it into flour, which then turns it into bread, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a classic illustration of it. There is a more Kabbalistic idea that it's called the grinder that grinds the mun. And again, what is the mun? It is the ultimate expression of Hashem's chesed in a tangible form, just like a child who longs for a gift from the parent. So the parent wants to gift the child love. In fact, there's a story where the 5th Rebbe, when he saw his young son, who of course would grow up to be the 6th Rebbe, who was a little baby, he felt this great love for him. And he wanted to pick him up and kiss him. But he decided instead that he would channel that love, and he wrote a mimer of Chassidus, which he then later gave to his son. which of course the child wouldn't appreciate the kiss at that moment, and it comes and it goes. But this mimer was an eternal manifestation. Like people, they'll write poetry or they turn it into art. That is, they take some raw, expansive, almost infinite character trait, and they are successful in channeling it into something very particular. Which is basically the alternative to most people who go, ah, or they get very excited and they just start cheering, or they say something very clumsy. I love you more than hockey. It's an attempt to squeeze something very raw and very powerful into something very tangible, which is not so easy to do. So we have a method and a process, and that's what the spheres are, and that's what Netzach and Hoid are. They take the raw energy of Chesed or of Gevura, and they start to tangibilize it and make it into something that can be measured and captured. That again grinds the mun for the righteous. That is a Kabbalistic reference to this idea that it takes the raw divine energy and it manifests it in something material and beneficial and tangible. Just like a person grinds the raw wheat in a grinder. Again, it takes the raw wheat, which is pretty miraculous, what it means to turn a seed into the wheat stalks. But in its rawest form, it's like raw chesed. It's not very useful. It needs to be nuanced and worked over until it becomes something that can, in fact, be made use of. Just like it grinds up the wheat into small pieces, very small pieces. Similarly, similarly, the father, in his desire to communicate to the child, if he's going to speak to the child at the fatherly level, the child's not going to understand what he's talking about. So the father has to work very diligently to take this very intense idea and make it accessible to the child without dumbing it down to the point that it's worthless and meaningless, or without it being so diluted that it never really gets to the primary message. I mean, that is the genius of Shlomo HaMelech in being able to say 3,000 analogies, parables, and similes, is that once the person matures past it, he doesn't discard the analogy. He doesn't outgrow it. Again, we can all imagine circumstances where a person wants to communicate something to a child and the child understands it, but when the child becomes an adult, they still think of it in that childish form, and therefore it's not meaningful to them at any level because they're still thinking in that childish process that it was introduced to them. So in contrast, when we talk about every life lesson that we derive from Torah, we still hold dear onto that initial lesson and that initial entry path into it. So that's the important thing, much like we talked a lot about in Iggeres HaTshuva, that we have lower tshuva and higher tshuva. But it's not like, lower tshuva, once we outgrow that, we don't need that anymore. This is a somewhat precarious issue that we run into in the representation of Yiddishkeit, because we're always looking for the personal life lesson that we derive from everything in Torah. So sometimes it might be tempting to say, okay, now that I've derived the life lesson, I no longer need the entry point that got me to the lesson. So if the purpose of kashrus is to teach me to be disciplined about my eating habits, once I'm disciplined about it, I no longer need the rules of kashrus. If the purpose of matzah is to remind me of the Exodus, once I can remember it, I know I discard the matzah. This is a dangerous path that, I mean, we have seen in the world of Jewish people trying to make Yiddishkeit appealing. They wound up making it so much about self-help that the person said, okay, but now I have Freud, or now I have some other self-help book, and I can discard Torah. This is the dangerous part that we have to be so cautious about. So the spheros are not just ways for us to have an entry into some discussion, which we then eventually outgrow, like training wheels, and we no longer need these because now we can ride by ourselves. This is what we have to be cautious about in Torah. So here we talk about that when the father comes to express this idea to the child, he has to ride this very delicate balance between communicating this idea with its full-on intensity, but in a manner that is accessible to the child. Break them up into many pieces, and give them a little tiny bit. In like little bite-sized pieces, vidas. What else is included within netzach? Because that takes a lot of work. It's really hard to explain things to somebody at their level, and people get frustrated. And I can only imagine we've all had this experience, and they wind up getting frustrated because you don't understand because they don't understand it. I mean, if you want to know if you truly understand something, explain it to somebody who has absolutely no concept. And when we start getting frustrated with the student, it's because the teacher doesn't understand it. Hopefully not, but I can only imagine that everybody has had such an experience, whether they were the student and the teacher was just getting annoyed with them that they didn't understand it, or they were the teacher and they started to recognize the frustration that they were feeling in their inability. This ties into a broader concept that we've seen, where the Alter Rebbe writes in the Sefer Shel Beinanim as a mechanism to prompt us to be more passionate about our service of Hashem, where he basically says, look how much work God has to go through to create this world. I mean, he's got to make it in a way that we can have some access. So he's got to make it, I say the silly, in a silly way, he's got to dumb it down for us. I know that's, I'm being a little silly about that, but still make it accessible, because we know what happens when we dumb it down so much. Then we just think of ourselves as superior. Well, that's for silly, shallow people. They need that. I don't need that. Well, we make it so abstract. We say, well, I can't. I'm just worried about making it till tomorrow. This is way more than I can deal with. So how does Hashem hit that Goldilocks kind of sweet spot where it is accessible to me, but not something that is seen as being overly simplistic that I eventually outgrow? And this is where the spheros help us along. And help us along personally, as we can start to categorize our impulses and our behaviors, we start to get somewhat of a grasp on them as a method through which we can develop them. So if I recognize these different spheros, I can recognize what I need to work on. I need to work on my chesed, or I don't even recognize. I recognize that I am overly protected. I need to work on my chesed, or I recognize that I'm too scattered. I need to work on my gevura. By having names and terms, I'm able to address the issues that exist within. Okay.
Rabbi, I have a quick question. You mentioned a little bit earlier, you went through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 3 was application, but I didn't actually catch what you said, how you defined 1 and 2. Okay. I thought maybe you'd end up going back to it, but
well, let's go back to it right now. So here's the chart. So tier 1 is the intellect. So our rule of thumb is that everything begins with our intellect. Now, when we say intellect, we don't mean how many pages of the Talmud I've read. We mean beginning with my willingness to imagine that there is something other than myself. So if I say, well, this is who I am, I'm just a very organized person. I need everything to be in its perfect slot. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but we can all imagine that. Or, I just love to share with people, but I can't be like on time or whatever it is. So it begins with, I have to imagine that there's something beyond just, well, this is how it is, and this is what I do, and this is how I do it. So I become receptive to the infinity of Hashem. Remember that human capacity to look up and not just like an animal that's on all fours and only sees the patch of grass that's right in his face, the human capacity to look up and see the infinite of the sky. That's imagination. And then, okay, so I recognize that I'm not locked into this. And it's not just, well, this is how I am and there's nothing I can do about it. Then I move on to the analysis where I start to cogitate on that and start to get, or try to get, a little bit more specific about how, in fact, I'm going to put this into play. And then the hardest thing is das. So now it's not just a conceptual idea. I have to now start to bring it into my character. So the first way I bring it into my character is about being limitless. So again, overly simplified illustration. I know that I'm very protected. I'm a little suspicious and so on. I need to be more forthcoming. I'm a little too much looking out for number one. I'm too much on, well, what's in it for me and how does this help me? And I need to be aware of other people. So I'm going to be limitless. I'm not going to say, well, if I give him, then I'm not going to have any. Then, it's a pie chart. And if you get a piece, it comes out of my pocket. I got to overcome that. Okay, so that's, again, it's still the product of the imagination that there's something beyond just, well, this is how it is and this is how I always do it. Or if it's on this side of it, and again, it's never so, like I'm calling it, like silos, but you get the idea. Okay, I need to be more disciplined. I need to be on time. I need to be more reliable. I need to make sure my checkbook is balanced. And I can't be so scattered and losing my keys and my wallet and everything. I need to be more fixated. So again, now I have gone from the conceptual imagination to the characteristic within myself that I'm now going to put a focus on. Then I have to put that into place. So what is that going to look like? That's going to look like that I'm going to continue to offer help to people, endurance. I'm not going to sort of give up because this is too much work. So I decided I'm going to be kind. I'm going to tutor this person in Hebrew reading, and I'm not going to get all frustrated with them if they can't remember the difference between a kometz and a patach or whatever it is. And I'm not going to get all irritated. So that I'm going to have endurance. My chesed is going to keep on going. I mean, probably everybody's recognizing this is a lot about what we talk about between Pesach and Shavuos when we count the Omer, Spia Ras HaOmer. This is very much what we do. Or on this side. Okay, so Gevura, I'm going to restrain myself. I'm not going to be the one, I'm going to realize that other people are relying on me. So the fact that I can't get my act together is putting myself ahead of other people. And I keep coming 15 minutes late and so on. I'm thinking about myself. I'm not thinking about other people. So I'm going to restrain myself so that other people can have, again, the glory, maybe in that context, I don't know if we call that glory, but they're going to have their needs met because they need me to be on time. So again, the chachma is the conceptual idea because we could always control what I think about. Our character says, this is who I am. I'm just a giving person or a organized person or whatever it is. So the tier one, the origin, is that I'm not locked into, well, this is just how it is. Tier two is when I start to work on what particular characteristic. It's like, if the teacher sends home a note and it says, Johnny's a bad boy, well, that's not very helpful. If he says, Johnny needs to work on being on time, okay, now I have a specific goal. Johnny needs to play well with others. Now I have a specific goal. And then it's going to manifest itself in the tier three, and then the action is here in Malchus. So I'm working on my limitless. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Everyone, we've got this in the email, so hopefully that's useful.
Yeah, great.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay, good. So here we go. So back into the mechanism where the father is explaining this idea to the child, and he's got a teeter-totter on this very delicate balance where he's both being communicative but not overwhelming the kid, but not so watered down that it's just basically childish. And then eventually the kid grows up. I mean, our classic experience in the Jewish world is the kid who goes to Hebrew school and all he gets is a little, Abraham smashed the idols. And maybe that's interesting when he's 11, 12, 13, and then that's it, you know. And then he looks back and he says, well, that's all it is just a bunch of fairy tales and childish stories, and you know, it's not of any significance to me. Okay. To divide it up into little pieces, many of those little pieces, which is a lot of work. You know, that's a lot of work. Also part of netzach is he's going to stand up against every obstacle, including the kid who keeps saying, do you have a cat? You know, after I've explained, or they don't get it, they don't understand it, and the teacher gets frustrated and so on. You know, this is why it's so much more difficult to teach first grade than it is to teach, you know, a master's class. But even in the master's class, they're getting frustrated because they really want to be teachers or they just want to be scholars. And this said he's teaching him both internally and externally, meaning he's trying to express it in a manner that should be meaningful. And again, this is the objective of that second tier, the third tier of the midas, which is to start putting into play. You know, again, sorry to bring up a contemporary example, but and then that would be too distracting. You know, well, it depends on the context. Well, sure, if you live in that world of academia where everything is, well, it's a philosophical question, and you don't live in the world of reality because you just, you know, writing papers that you publish in publications that other people who write papers read and they all talk about it, and it just goes round and round and round. You become so detached from facts on the ground. You know, it's the most bizarre illustration of the absent-minded professor, because you're living in this whole world of you write papers that you publish in publications that other people who write papers read, and then they publish papers and around and around, and like it's almost like a Dungeons and Dragons kind of life where it's never in contact with any tangible facts on the ground. What does this mean? Bias internally. So again, there's one level. Again, we're talking about somebody trying to work on a chesed quality. So what's going on internally is the desire to be very rigid and so on. That is almost becoming frustrated with the child, so that the easiest thing is to say, well, you just don't understand. You know, this is not you, right? Because you don't have the patience and the endurance, the netzach, to keep on going until the child understands. They just give up. You know, we probably all had this experience. Maybe it's a little better now. You know, when computers first came out, and it was so frustrating, and everybody was a novice. And if you knew a little tiny bit, you were so far ahead of everybody else. And then you'd be on, you know, customer service, and they would be getting frustrated with you. You know, don't you know that? It's like you go to the post office. Don't you know you need the R74 9AB, that we retired the 98C last month? Didn't you know that? Well, no, I didn't know that. So getting annoyed with this. I mean, what is the classic thing that people say? Well, I came to the synagogue, you know, or they're terrified of coming because they think everyone's just going to say, well, don't you know what page we're on? You know, to give, you know, just give him an aliyah. Well, he doesn't know what to do, and we understand. So he feels so completely awkward, he leaves, you know, because who wants to feel stupid? It's hard. But on the other hand, you know, nobody even paid attention. They didn't even give me an aliyah. So we're trying to find that perfect balance. So the father may have somewhat of a temptation to become frustrated with the kid, you know, sort of roll his eyes out loud, as we say. And he needs to overcome that. That's where Netzach comes in, where he has to continue relentless in his kindness. What then is the Yisoid? That is the basic connection. With that classic line that they tell you in every teacher's meeting, they won't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? You have to bond with them. So what does everybody complain? Nobody cares. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares. So again, we could mock that, or I'm mocking that at least. But if there isn't that basic sense of connection, then right. And as we know, if I kind of like somebody, I'm more likely to agree with what they have to say, because it's much more personality driven than it is conceptually driven. But here, we're not talking about it in a manipulative sense, although that could happen, right? I mean, that happens. That's what I mean, this is a harsh criticism and unfair, but every good salesman knows that you sell yourself. And if they like you, they'll buy your insurance, or they'll buy your copy machine, or they'll buy your car because they like you. And there's a certain magnetism that some people have that makes people want to be connected with them. And what's going to be connected with the salesman? If I'll buy his insurance policy, and especially something that's more and more commoditized. So Yesod is that basic connection. If the student truly feels that the teacher is concerned with him, that there is a real connection with the teacher, the student is more receptive to learning from that teacher. But if he just feels that the teacher is dictating from on high, well, it's less likely. It's harder to be connected. The father makes the effort. I mean, I'm not an international traveler, but people who do, they have had the experience that if you try to speak the local language, they will be patient with you, and they will, because you're making an effort to connect with them at a human level, and therefore they're more likely to want to be connected at an intellectual or a character level as well. Okay, I think everyone got the idea. And he learns with him. It's a way of love, and it's a way that he wants to do it instead of getting all annoyed and frustrated and so on. He wants his child to understand it. People have shared this, that they go for a Shabbos table. It's a new experience for them. And they see, the kids come home with their Parsha questions, or the father is asking the child the question, and the father is happier when the child knows the answer. Now, out there in the world, when people ask questions, it's so they can gotcha, right? Don't you hate it when people ask questions when they really mean to make statements? Don't you hate that? Meaning, people ask questions because they want to show you what they know. That's why people wind up asking those questions, because it becomes a power play. But when it's a method of love, it's not a method of I'm going to establish my alpha dog stature here, but rather it's a mechanism through which we can communicate with one another, we can bond with each other. Now it's going to be meaningful, and that's this level of Yesod. So again, if a person recognizes, and again, with the point being here, that when a person has a sense that there's a certain character flaw that they have, and they start to think about, well, that's just the way I am, we say, well, look, if we can break it down and we can identify what is your particular issue, this can become a mechanism through which you can correct it. So if I'm not getting along, does not play well with others, well, maybe I need to work on my Yesod. So by identifying it, I can start to nuance it and so on. And again, ultimately, in my relationship with Hashem, we are created in the image of Hashem. We have this capacity to be in this connection. Okay. So here is another classic issue. And again, probably everybody, hopefully nobody, but probably everybody had this experience. You have a teacher, and this teacher is a scholar, because that is common who becomes teachers, because they love scholarship. So let's say in the secular world, they love Shakespeare, they love history, they love physics, but they don't pay you a salary to just read Shakespeare. So they become a teacher. Why? Because they want to get a salary, they want to get paid. But they're not really teaching, they're just studying out loud. So they study out loud, they call that teaching. Meaning they're not attenuating their scholarship to the student. They would just as well do this by themselves. They'd just as well be standing out in front of an empty classroom reading the book themselves. So unfortunately, we call that teaching in unhealthy or less than ideal circumstances. So what's the difference? You're getting the same information. And this is the point, that even if we heard the same exact lecture, but there's no bond. We remember the Alter Rebbe quoted in the beginning of Tanya the story of Rabbah, that he would literally make a joke before he gave his class. So they say, what are you making jokes for? Because there's a distance between teachers and students, and there's a separation, and the student is so awed by the teacher and intimidated by the scholarship of the teacher, that he's less likely to be able to internalize the lesson. So the teacher makes a joke, it brings them closer. Because when we feel a closeness, we really truly sense that the teacher is yearning to connect with me, not just to further their own research, and I'm just the test dummy out there to have it the experiment tried on, but he's really talking to me. Now it's really something meaningful, and it's going to resonate. He speaks with him with love and desire. He really wants his son to know and understand what he's teaching him. I mean, that's the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher. I mean, even think about this. You ask a person, how's your doctor? Oh, I love my doctor. Why? Oh, he's so patient. Is he a good doctor? Hopefully you never have to find out. Hopefully you go. He does a basic checkup and you don't have to find out. But what do there's a sense of connection. I mean, even historically, to use maybe a Torah example, we know that the Kohanim and the Leviim were supported by the tzedakahs, the Truma and Maisa. So why were there some rich Kohanim and some poor Kohanim? Because people like them. I mean, who did the people give the Truma to? The guy they liked. I mean, it was subject to being manipulated and so on. Why do people go to that doctor or that dentist? They like him. Is he the best dentist? Is he a super? Most people, most of the time, what did he do? X-rays, you go to the optometrist, better A, better B, drill your teeth, fill it in. Hopefully it's nothing more than that. But why do you go? Because I like him, because there's a sense that he listens to me. And again, we've probably all, hopefully none, but we've probably all had the experience. They don't listen. They just want to do what they want to do. You hire the guy to do something, and he wants to do what he wants to do. He's not listening. There's no connection. There's no bond. And again, it can be manipulative as well. He's very good at bonding, but then he doesn't do the job. He sells you a bill of goods, as we talked. Okay. So too, in all forms of transmission and study, the more receptive the student is, the more giving the father is. Because the more he feels a love for his student, and the more the student feels a love for the teacher, the more the student is going to gobble up from the teacher, and the more the teacher is going to express to the student. There's going to be this bond between them that is going to enrich the intellectual process. By this, and this is why we compare the relationship between a teacher and a student to a romantic relationship. The more intense the love, the greater the desire to be close and to take what the other has to give. So the more the student feels the teacher's love, the more the teacher feels the student's love, the more giving it is. And again, this is in our relationship with Hashem. So I know it's a very sort of pat rabbi thing to say when the person says, well, I don't feel God's presence in my life. Why doesn't God do this for me? Why doesn't God do that for me? And our response is the more we do for Hashem, the more we express love to Hashem, the more that love comes back. I mean, we know this in our own interpersonal relationships. We're very guarded and so on. This is the expressive side of the soul. Now, that word chitzonius, I don't know what it's translated in the lessons in Tanya and so on. It commonly has a pretty derogatory term. It's like phony almost. It's like the external side. But it's not. That's not the context here. Here it means the manifestation of it. Whereas chesed is a concept, endurance is a practice. Where restraint is a concept, the glory thing, restraint, that's a practice. So that's really what it means. Not chitzoni says in shallow or not significant. Based within them, they are driven by the inner midos. Shehein bechinas ava v'yira, which are ava and yira. Ava and yira, the desire to be close with Hashem and the fear of distance from Hashem. That's what drives every character trait. A person innately wants to be close with Hashem, and a person innately senses that they are distant from Hashem. And that's a healthy balance. We have an intuitive awareness of our relationship with Hashem. Are you Jewish? You want to do the mitzvah. And we have this healthy sense that I am distant from Hashem and I am yearning to be close to Hashem. So Ava and Yira sort of supersede, again, if we go back, we have to go back to the chart, but if we go back to the chart, that's what drives us. Why should I? Because I naturally love Hashem. That is an intuitive programming. It comes in your standard equipment. That's how you come out of the factory. Your neshama is a part of Hashem, and therefore it longs to be connected with Hashem, and is concurrently aware of its separation from Hashem. So too, back to the teacher-student or father-son relationship. Why does the father teach the son how to read the Aleph Beis, study the Talmud, drive, go fishing, and so on? Because the parent loves the child. That's what drives him to do it. And he simultaneously is aware that I have to revere the child. I have to respect the child and not overwhelm him. There's a phrase out there, it's called love bombing. You may have heard this phrase before. It's where the person, I love you. You don't love me so much, just pick me up on Tuesday. And it feels like, or it seems like, it's a very kind way to express my commitment to the person. But the person is like, stop saying you love me, and do what I ask you to do. I mean, you don't even respect me. If I say I love everyone, I love no one. It doesn't mean anything. So the father, in his great desire to be close to his son, he loves him, and concurrently, he loves him, so he doesn't overwhelm him. He has reverence for who the child is. That's the Yira quality. So it's driven by Ava and it's driven by Yira. And where is this driven from? What drives this? That's the Chabad. That's what I called tier 1. That's that first level of the Chachma, Bina, and Das. That's what drives this capacity. So I recognize the infinity. And this is a general rule that we have, and we've probably all experienced again intuitively. It's one that Hasidus Chabad comes down very strongly on, that our midos are attenuated by our intellect. As we can see, Shakat and Shachabad Shaleim Bechinas Katnis, Kachom Midos, Vein Bidvarin Katni Adach. Lagam Gdel, and Fi Sichla Yeholu Ish, Ki the Fire for Chamasai, Kachureva Avasa Vechazde. What I just would call simply maturity. So a young child, his intellect is not that developed. So what does he like? He likes childish things. He likes small things. As we grow and mature, our intellect expands. So we have a desire for greater things. We all know people who are adults, but they're still just as childish. They're just as petty, just as overly simplistic, just as impatient, and so on. And we know children who are very mature, and they have a desire for far more significant matters than just things that we think of as being immediately childish. The old joke, the kid would rather have $10 than a bank book that says he has $1 million, because the $10 is staring him in the face, or the marshmallow test, all of these different illustrations about childish desires in contrast to more adult desires. And as we age, hopefully we mature, our intellect drives our heart. So not only that we bypass things because we know it's not healthy for us, we don't even want those things, and we want more matured matters. We live in a society that sort of celebrates childishness and encourages adults to act like children without any purpose to their behavior, and so on. Okay, all of his midas, both the conceptual idea, what I'm calling tier 2, and the implementable ideas, which I call tier 3, are all driven by the intellect. Again, when we say intellect, we don't mean your IQ. We don't mean how many pages of the Torah you've committed to memory. We mean your capacity to imagine something outside of yourself. Ve'ikar hu adas, and the primary is das. Now, das is the least exciting of the intellectual properties. It's not the great imagination, and it's not taking that imagination to a vision. It's the sale. It's the sales job. So a person comes up with a conceptual idea for the greatest mousetrap, and he goes through the Bina process so that he develops this great mousetrap. And now he has to go to Walmart and hope that people come by and buy his mousetrap. So that's not exciting, but that's where it is. Otherwise, I'm right. I have a PhD in kindness, but I'm not doing anything kind. I'm a master of ethics, but I'm not ethical. So das is where we link the intellect to the character. Shaboy hanimshach b'chinas hachachmo bina shaboy kenira b'chosh lefi shina ideis b'nei adam zemizeh kacho shina midaisa. This is where we link. We all go to the same classes. We all hear the same farbrengens. We all hear the same messages. The difference is not how many pages I know. The difference is how much I am capable of internalizing it. And that's the hard part. Because, again, we love to sit up late in dorm rooms and talk about the philosophies and the conceptual. But how much we implement it and personalize it, that's really where the challenge is. And that's the least exciting part of the whole intellectual experience. And again, we have, now that you understand, remember, you don't understand, we always got to be extra super duper cautious about this. We have to go back to that this is only an analogy. Because again, this is what human beings can understand about this. You recall that when we learned the Sefer Shel Beinanim, we talked about tzaddikim, and we emphasized that's all what a Beinani could understand about a tzaddik. It's not really what a tzaddik is. That's simply what a Beinani could understand about a tzaddik. It's not what a tzaddik is. So too, this is what we can understand about Hashem. But never mistake this to say, oh, I know this one. Because our neshama, our human soul, remember, the Alter Rebbe makes this point, that a Jew's humanity is different than a Gentile's humanity. A Jew's humanity comes from klipas noiga. It's a klipa, it's not obviously godly, like his nefesh elokis, but light trickles through. Light trickles through. When we get down to, we dig down all the way to the truth, in the nefesh elokis, that is an actual part of Hashem. The concept of midas are really all one and the same. You remember the stencil analogy? If we go higher and higher beyond that funnel, it's all the same origin. It's all exactly the same origin. It's the infinity of Hashem. And then it's manifest through these different aspects, just as we are. We talk about this with our names. We have different names depending on our relationships. Your child calls you one name, your friends call you a different name, your customers call you another name, the bus driver calls you passenger, and so on. That because of his great love for Hashem, his desire to be connected with him, he just wants to be connected, to attach himself to Hashem. Like all of those stories of the Hasidim who would just pour out their lives to Hashem. They just cry out to Hashem. They bypass all of this. Like we have that halacha that if the man marries a woman and he says it's on the condition that I'm a Kohen, if he's not a Kohen, they're not married. If he says on the condition that I'm strong. So we have a certain measurement, or rich. What's called rich? There's a certain way we measure. So then the Gemara says that if the man marries the woman, he says on the condition that I am a tzaddik. So we say, well, we always have to be concerned. Maybe they are taka married. All right, what do you mean? This morning he was in McDonald's eating pork. Yeah, but maybe in that moment he did tshuva. So you can bypass all of the midos and everything, and you can in a moment be connected with Hashem. Because again, the midos are this side of the stencil. In the origin, there is no distinction.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Can you reread that in the Hebrew, ki me necham me
Machmas avos Hashem, because of his love of Hashem, u'mereiv chafetz on his overwhelming passion, ledovka by, to be attached to him, who chafetz chesed, he desires kindness, Kidei lidbek b'midaisiv. He just wants to be associated with Hashem.
Thank
K'mayim
you.
Razal, I'll pass to you. K'mayim Razal, like our sages say in the Gemara on the Pasuk of Dovkabay, it says we should attach ourselves to Hashem. The Gemara asks the seemingly obvious question: how can you attach yourself to Hashem? Is Hashem not an all-consuming fire? So it answers, attach yourself to His character. This emulate His character. God visits the sick, you visit the sick. God tends to the dead, you tend to the dead. God clothes the naked, you clothe the naked. I mean, lahavdil, to use a very silly analogy, it's like a person who starts to take on the mannerisms of their teacher, their inflection, their motion, and so on. They want so much to be aligned with the teacher or with the parent who they love. That's not necessarily an unhealthy thing. I mean, it can become silly, but it's not necessarily an unhealthy thing, that they start to, I use this word mimic, but I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. They start to mirror their character. Well, that we want to be associated with Hashem, so we start acting in a godly way. So too in the ways of Gevura, to be restrictive, even to implement the punishments. You know, that's a hard thing. Everyone likes to be a nice guy. Who wants to punish? But if you don't punish, then you're not emulating the ways of Torah, and you're encouraging rampant misbehavior. So we don't want to judge who's a sadist, and we don't want to judge who's a total pacifist. Right? I mean, it's not his. If he's implementing God's law, it's not his to decide. Well, I know God said you're not allowed to do it, but I think you should. You know, people say to me, Rabbi, would you let me? Would I? I don't care what you do, but God does care. I don't care. And to overcome his Yetzirah. And even to sanctify myself in things that are permitted. You know, this is the distinction. If I truly love Hashem, I'm not just looking to check every box, now leave me alone. I am longing to be connected with Hashem. So even if I'm, quote, allowed to, I can go home early. What do you mean go home early? I want to stay. So again, if it's just an obligation, I say, when's quitting time? If it's an opportunity, then I'm there as much as I can. I'm so cautious. I don't want to do anything that could be in any way offensive to Hashem. I don't want to mess it up. And so I'm extraordinarily sensitized to it. Lest I come to sin. And again, now the glory of Hashem in all ways. How do I give glory to Hashem? By restraining myself and making Hashem the most prominent determinant of my behavior. To connect myself with the praises of God. To speak of Hashem, to contemplate of Hashem, to speak of Hashem in every way possible. I give glory to Hashem because I am constantly, you know, it's like people feel pride in their country, pride in their college, pride in their team. They carry it with them wherever they go. They are constantly a billboard for the great virtues of their beloved. And again, to implement that midah of nitzachon, I have translated as relentless. It also comes from the term for victory. Victory goes to the one who doesn't give up. There's no surrender. Like all the battles that David HaMelech engaged in, there's no giving up. As Golda Meir said, we have no place else to go. So that's why we're absolute. And again, to give thanks to Hashem and to see that there's nothing that can stop me because no thing has any stature relative to the infinity of Hashem. So I don't keep going until I say, well, how much more I got to do? Or, well, that's it. I've run out. There's no give up in that. And that's this characteristic of Netzach. Even though we can't understand that, because I certainly feels like the Lego piece I stepped on is real. So it's hard for me to conceptualize that no thing has any stature compared to the infinity of Hashem. Alpha BK, nevertheless. I acknowledge it completely. That this is in fact how it is. And that means that I can always find something to be grateful to Hashem about. Not to deny the goodness, and to give thanks and praise to Hashem for all that He does. I can think about what Hashem does in the worlds of Atzilus and in the creation of the world, and even the least evidently godly worlds, that our praise for Hashem is without end. This is again that hoid thing, that I can always be in praise of Hashem. And like we say, the tzaddik is the basis of the whole world, that my soul should be attached with Hashem, the source of all life. And I should attach myself with intensity and longing and passion in a manner that is wondrously enthusiastic, not a chore. Malchus, and what then is Malchus? The seventh, where I put it into play, is I accept the yoke of obligation of behavior, because still I get to this level of Malchus like a king. Again, we don't have a good word in English for this, but presidents preside, the same word. Governors govern, same word. Kings, if we had a verb to king, meaning he takes the intensity of the king and implements it into the particulars of character, stop signs and taxes and so forth, and to see the passion of my relationship with Hashem in that experience. To serve like a devoted soldier with reverence and awe. And where is this all rooted? What is the key factor to get this going? That is in the intellect, because that's what we can always control. And that is the control tower of everything. I can get myself worked up in my head to be angry at somebody, keep you stupid, Jack, if you know that whole long story, or I can get myself to be loving and enthusiastic. I can always control what I willfully think about. And this is the key message of Chabad. And from there, it goes to the character, to the implementation. Think it, feel it, do it. That is the key. The Hainu HaChachma Hu Makar HaSeichel, HaMasig Es Hashem V'Chachmas V'Losu Mideis V'Agdeish Shemaning U'Machai B'Hen Kol Olim Eslayim V'Tachteinim. First, you have Chachma, the willingness to be amazed, the power of what? The receptivity to something completely outside of what I know, which is the hardest thing, because learning shakes up everything about me. Like I use the analogy about language. It's so awkward because I don't like feeling stupid. So if I'm learning, that means I recognize not just that there's information that I don't know, and now I know the state capitals or the names of the currencies of different countries, but to truly be receptive to being shaken out of what I've always thought about, that's really disruptive and very uncomfortable. That's what Chachma is. So a child, we just had in Matan Torah where we pledged our children, we pledged to be like a child. We pledged to be wide-eyed and enthusiastic and not cynical. I know that one, or I know, okay, so what you're really saying is, and then I just summarize into something that I already know, because it's very disturbing to learn something completely radically new. It's not pleasant. And then Ubina, what is Bina? He is Bainanis, Basaga Zoy, Ba'erch Barech. I take the idea, I contemplate it, I think about it, I give it depth and length and meaning. And I start to see the parallel. We do this all the time in Talmud. We take a concept from the laws of Shabbos and we apply it to the laws of contracts, because we dig down to the essential kernel of the logic behind it. And then there should be the product. And we use the conception idea. Chachma and Bina is like the father and the mother, and the child, the offspring, is the character. And just like a child is a representation of their parents, you want to know who you are, look at your children. Oh, your children are the representation, because that's where they got it from. They got it from you. So too, the midas are an expression of the intellect. V'shari midas halnoldus b'nefesh halakis hamaskeles umizbeininais begulash Hashem, and all of the other midas that are the product of the godly soul that thinks about the infinity of Hashem. That's the key. So I feel trapped. This is who I am. I'm just a organized person, or I'll never be organized. This is just who I am, and that's who I am. Again, we are all born with a personality, but ein mazel Yisrael, literally Jews have no mazel, meaning we're not restricted to our character. Yes, we have a mazel, but it doesn't restrict us. I don't have to be that. Because God is infinite, and that infinity is accessible by me. And this is the infinity of Hashem. And if we will engage our intellect, which is very scary, again, I'd rather just sit where I am. And we've probably all met that person, and maybe it's even us. I'd rather be miserable in what I know than run the risk of having to change because I learned something completely new and radical. That's the scary, scary thought, to think that I will have to change. So life is miserable. Why don't you do something about it? Oh, it's too late. You can't. What can you do? That's the way it is. So sometimes a person could fall into that trap of preferring to just be disappointed rather than making any effort. Okay. Shehi Yira Tata, she Bechinas Malchus. This is entry level Yira, where we have reverence for Hashem. I have reverence Yira for my doctor. I do what he tells me. For my mechanic, I do what he tells me. That's an entry level of Yira for Hashem. I have confidence in Hashem. I have more confidence in Hashem than I quote have in myself. So if Hashem says to do it, I do it. Then there's a higher level, and it's called Yiras Boishes. Now, Yiras Boishes, if you put it in your Google Translate, comes up with like fear of shame, but it's not shame like I did something bad. Meaning, I become so humbled, which is the hardest thing. It's very hard to be humbled. I'd rather sit on the side and complain. I've noticed a phenomena, just to pontificate for a moment here. There used to be that people, quote unquote, criticized or stayed away from Torah and from Frumkeit because they saw, quote, Frum people as being parochial and narrow-minded and so on. Now, what I have observed with people is they stay away because it's too hard. Meaning, they used to think, oh, those people, they're so shallow and they're so backwards and so on. So I'm advanced. I am a person of the world. And now what I hear from people, again, kids today, not like when we were kids, but now what I hear from people is, it's too much work. It's too hard. It's a different phenomenon, meaning instead of sort of looking down at them and saying, well, you people are so backward, they now say, well, you people are up on it. I can't do that. I can never get my house that clean for Passover. I could never give tzedakah. I could never keep kosher. It's too hard. So they used to say, oh, it's so backwards, and I'm the person of expanse. Now, this other one, that's what they're afraid of, is Yiras Boishes, of being overwhelmed by it. I don't want to be overwhelmed by it. I don't want to be inspired and change things. It's too much work. Okay, back into the text. Then there's this great, overwhelming, overflowing love. Or even a, quote, smaller love. I love God because God gives me life, and I like to be alive. Also in the expressive midas. But the key is the fire comes through the das. The intellect enlightens and enlivens the midas. And that's why a person has to learn Torah. And say, well, I know what to do already, but that's not what it's about. If I am not engaging in fueling the fire of the midas will wither. Shemaseges eze inye migdulas Hashem shememena noldu ba eze mida mia midas that we have to continuously be striving to understand it. Now, I can just share with you that out there in the world of Torah, there's a very different perspective. I'm talking amongst Torah people who would say, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The whole thing is about studying Torah. Torah is the thing. It's all about Torah. And I'm not criticizing it. It's a very different position. We are saying here, it's all about the implementation. What is going to fuel the implementation is Torah study. That Torah is great because it leads to change character. It's a nuance, it's a subtlety, but it's a fundamental difference between them. The greatness of Torah study is that it fuels the character, which results in the change behavior, and not just about some sort of academic accumulation of information. Okay. If you stop thinking about Karega Masagazu, from that moment, then the Mida goes away. As we know, when I'm sitting there on a nice quiet day and I have the resolve to stick to my budget, but then when they dangle the sale item in front of my face and I stop thinking about it, goodbye, boom. Now the Mida went away. The intellect went away, the Mida went away. I turned the light switch off, the Mida went away. You know, if we're not connected to that source, if we're not fueling it through Torah study, the Mida flutters away. It'll just be there in concept, but not in action. That's why it is called unity, partnership. This is Adam Nu Chava. It's about being unified. And the unity is between the intellect and the character. And without the intellect fueling that character, again, the character dissipates. That spreads out the midos
2 minutes.
and gives life to those midos. To fulfill them. Yesh bechinas das ha'elyon, shehu bechinas eskashus echibur mokar ha'seichel ha'masik, oimig ha'musik, shu kunakuda kabar kamabrich ha'sichle. Then there is the time when we can reach that, we get that core point. As we say, you get it. And again, we probably all have experienced this in a positive sense. Even if I don't understand every nuance, I get the core concept. It's like teaching a child. You teach them 2 times 3 is 6, and 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 times 5 is 10, and whatever it is, right? They go through, so that now that's just information. But then they get the idea, oh, it's 2, 3 times. It's 2, 4 times. Wow, now they get it. Now they understand, they have the entryway into all of math, because they've gotten the nakuda, the basic point, not just to recite back like a call and repeat. 2 times 5 is 10, and they memorized it all the way up to 10 digits. It's they get the conceptual idea that you're saying it's 2, 3 times, or 2 times 3, whatever it is. Okay. She is and it becomes comprehended in expanse of understanding. With length, they can apply it. And they can apply it across the board, like we talked about before, a lateral application of conceptual ideas into unrelated contexts. That is true bina. That's called a wide river. From that core essence, it becomes expanded. As is explained in other places. Okay, it's a little long today, but we made it through the letter. Okay.